When Dad died, the lawyer's office smelled like lemon polish and old paper. The kind of smell that makes you feel small, even if you've spent your whole life pretending not to care about things like money or inheritance. I sat on one side of the long mahogany table, clutching my coffee like it was proof I still belonged there. Across from me sat Evan, my stepbrother, though nobody ever called him that. To the world, he was simply the son, the one who made Dad proud. He wore that easy, effortless confidence like a pressed shirt. I was the one who came home only on holidays, the one who taught middle school English in a town no one ever visits twice. The lawyer, a gray man named Halpern, read from the will in a voice that could have belonged to an undertaker. He said things like residuary estate and beneficiary and hereby bequeath, and I watched his thin lips move, waiting for my name. When it came, it was small. A list of personal items, sentimental effects, he said, including a wooden box marked Sarah. Everything else, the house, the land, the savings, even Dad's fishing boat, went to Evan. Evan reached across the table and patted my hand, like he was the one offering condolences. "It's just what Dad wanted," he said, in that careful voice people use when they're trying to make guilt sound like compassion. I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes. "Sure, Evan, it's fine." It wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine since I was 12 and Dad remarried. When Linda moved in, she brought her son and her perfume and her unshakable belief that Evan was destined for great things. Dad believed it too. And maybe he was right. Evan had a talent for turning every situation in his favor. He'd been the valedictorian, the quarterback, the first to move out, the first to buy a house, the golden child, shining in every way I wasn't. I learned early to disappear quietly around him, to keep my opinions folded inside like paper cranes. After the reading, Halpern pushed a small wooden box toward me. It was the kind of box you'd expect to find letters in, polished cherry wood with a brass latch, my name carved faintly on the lid. Sarah. The sight of it made my throat tighten. Dad had always been a man of few words, the kind who left meaning in what he didn't say. Halpern cleared his throat. "There's also this," he said, handing me a small USB flash drive. "Your father instructed that it was for you only. It was inside the box when we opened the safe." Evan leaned forward, curiosity sharp in his eyes. "What's on it?" "I don't know," I said quickly, slipping it into my pocket before he could ask again. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of signatures and condolences. Evan made calls to the realtor before we'd even left the parking lot. "We'll sell the house as is," he told her. "Market's good right now." He didn't look at me when he said it, and I didn't expect him to. The house meant something to me. To him, it was a dollar amount. That night, I drove back to the house on the edge of town, the one with the big oak tree and the porch swing that hadn't moved in years. The place felt smaller than I remembered. Dust coated the furniture, and the air carried that stale mix of wood polish and time. I walked through each room like it was a museum of my own childhood. The dent on the stair rail from my bike handle, the chipped tile in the kitchen, the faded curtain prints Mom had picked out before she got sick. In the study, Dad's smell still lingered. Coffee, tobacco, something metallic and clean. I sat at his old desk and opened the wooden box. Inside were a few letters, a small gold watch, and a folded photograph of the three of us from years ago. Dad's arm was around Evan, and I was in the corner of the frame, looking off somewhere else. Underneath the photo was a note written in Dad's steady, blocky handwriting. "Sarah, if you're reading this, it means you kept your curiosity. That's good. You'll need it. What's on the drive isn't for Evan. Don't trust him with it. He'll think he understands, but he never saw what you saw. Some truths only belong to those who still care enough to look." I stared at the note for a long time. Dad wasn't a man of riddles. His words were usually plain, practical. But this sounded like something else, something deliberate. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. It took a moment before the screen came alive. There was one folder labeled Accounts. Inside were several encrypted files with strange names, strings of letters and numbers that looked like gibberish. A text file sat beside them titled Read Me First TXT. I opened it. "Sarah, I made mistakes. You know that. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do expect understanding. These files are not what they look like. They are protection for you. Evan doesn't need to see them. He already got his reward. You once told me that truth always finds its way out. I hope you were right. Dad. My pulse quickened. Protection. What could he possibly mean? I tried opening the other files, but they were all password protected. Every attempt brought the same message. Access denied. The next morning, I called Halpern. Do you know anything about what's on this drive? He hesitated. Your father was a private man. I wouldn't speculate. But he did tell me once that he wanted things to balance themselves out in time. Balance. That word stayed with me. I spent the next few days sorting through the house, pretending to help Evan's realtor while secretly searching for clues. The password, the meaning, the reason Dad would leave this to me. I checked drawers, old letters, even the inside of books. On the fourth day, I found it. A faded receipt taped inside a ledger book in Dad's handwriting, Belmont plus 1437. When I typed it into one of the encrypted files, it opened. The screen filled with rows of numbers, account names, and offshore banks, places like Zurich, Cayman, Panama. It was dizzying. My father, the quiet accountant who balanced other people's books for a living, had hidden millions overseas. I sat back, the air leaving my lungs. The man who lectured me about honesty, about doing things the right way, had built a secret empire in the shadows. That night, Evan came by. He'd already found a buyer for the house, he said, and they'd be closing by the end of the month. He was cheerful, animated, full of plans about renovations and market value. It's what Dad would have wanted, he said again. I looked at him and wondered how much he knew. Maybe he'd known all along. Maybe Dad's little empire wasn't such a secret after all. After he left, I went back to the laptop. I stared at those account balances, so vast, so cold, and felt something tighten inside me. Dad's words echoed, he already got his reward. I realized then that maybe this wasn't just about money. Maybe it was a test. A final puzzle meant only for me, the forgotten daughter, the one who still cared enough to look. The next few weeks passed in a kind of quiet war. Evan pushed for the house sale, while I pretended to sort through boxes and memories. At night, I studied the files, learning what I could. Dad had left notes embedded in the code, simple phrases like follow the trail or truth hides in plain sight. I began to piece together the pattern. The accounts weren't random. They were layered, disguised as company holdings. Some were linked to Evan's real estate ventures. That's when it clicked. Evan's business success hadn't been his own. Dad had funneled money to him through offshore shells, made him rich on paper while keeping the real control in his own hands. When Dad died, Evan inherited not just the house, but the entire web of false security. And now, by selling the house, he'd trigger the transfer of assets, exposing everything, but only if someone made the right call. I spent hours researching, quietly, carefully, IRS whistleblower programs, anonymous submissions, tax evasion penalties. It all started to take shape, a revenge that wasn't loud or cruel, but precise, surgical. The kind that didn't require confrontation, just a few clicks and patience. The night before the house went on the market, I stood in the empty living room and listened to the silence. The echoes of my own childhood seemed to hum in the walls. I remembered the way Dad's voice used to fill the house when he read to me at night. The way he'd say, "Fairness isn't about who wins, Sarah. It's about who learns." Maybe this was my lesson. When the realtor came in the morning, she found me in the kitchen, wrapping Dad's watch in tissue paper. "Are you keeping that?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Just this." By the time Evan called that afternoon, I'd already sent the encrypted files to the IRS's whistleblower office, anonymously through a secure upload. I didn't feel triumphant, just steady. Like something long unbalanced had finally shifted back into place. Evan's voice was bright on the phone. "Got the offer I wanted. You'll get your share of whatever's left after closing costs." "That's generous," I said quietly. "Well, you deserve something." He paused. "You doing okay?" "I am now," I said. "I really am." After we hung up, I sat at Dad's desk one last time. The flash drive lay beside the watch. I turned it over, running my thumb across the scratched metal. There was something almost poetic in it. A confession, a secret, a daughter's final act of loyalty turned into justice. I locked the drive back in the box and carried it out to the car. The oak tree rustled as I left, its branches heavy with the last of the summer leaves. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I was carrying it with me. End of part 1. Next part continues with the unraveling. Evan's downfall, Sarah's moral reckoning, and the emotional aftermath of her revenge. 3 weeks after the sale went through, I started getting the calls. Not from Evan, he stopped calling after the check cleared, but from whispers of our old life echoing through small-town gossip. In a place like Millersburg, news travels the way humidity does, slow at first, then all at once. I heard it first from Donna, one of the secretaries at my school. She leaned against my classroom doorway one afternoon, eyes bright with that specific curiosity that blooms in small towns when something bad happens to someone else. "Did you hear about Evan?" she asked. I froze, trying to sound casual. "No, what about him?" She lowered her voice. "IRS agents came to his office. Audit or something. They say it's serious." "Oh," I said, my throat dry. "I didn't know." She shrugged, satisfied by my reaction. I always thought he was too slick for his own good. "You okay, honey?" "Fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Thanks, Donna." After she left, I sat at my desk and stared at the half-graded essays in front of me. My students had written about moral courage in To Kill a Mockingbird, about doing what's right when it's hard. The irony wasn't lost on me. That evening, I went for a walk down by the river. It was late autumn by then, the air sharp enough to make my lungs ache. The sun dipped low over the water, painting the current gold. I thought about Evan, how sure he'd always been of his own success, how he'd smiled that day in the lawyer's office as if life had finally confirmed what he always believed, that he deserved everything. Now, somewhere in an office in the city, a team of accountants was dismantling that illusion piece by piece. At night, I dreamed about Dad's voice, low and steady, the way it used to sound when he was teaching me how to ride a bike. "Keep your eyes ahead, Sarah. You'll go where you look." I wondered if he'd planned it this way, if he'd known that leaving the money to Evan would be the only way to make the truth visible. Maybe his faith in balance hadn't been about fairness at all, but exposure. A week later, Evan called. I almost didn't answer. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight, "did you know anything about this? The audit?" I hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "They're freezing my accounts, every one of them. They say there are inconsistencies, offshore transfers linked to Dad's company, some dating back 15 years. I leaned against the counter, feeling my pulse in my fingertips. I didn't know. "Don't lie to me," he snapped. "You always hated me for what Dad gave me. Don't think I don't know that." "I don't hate you, Evan." "Yes, you do. You always have." His voice broke for a second. "You think I didn't notice how you looked at me that day in the office? Like I stole something that was yours?" "Didn't you?" I asked quietly. The silence on the other end was long. He hung up first. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching the lights of passing cars fade into the dark. There was no satisfaction in it, no thrill of vengeance, just the slow, heavy realization that justice, when it finally arrives, feels more like grief wearing a straighter spine. By December, word around town was that Evan had lost everything. The house, the boat, the investments, all seized or sold to pay back taxes and penalties. He'd disappeared somewhere out west, trying to rebuild. Linda, his mother, called me once, her voice brittle with accusation. "You always wanted to ruin him," she said. "You were jealous. Your father saw it, I saw it, everyone did." "I didn't ruin him," I said softly. "He did that himself." "You think you're better than him?" "No," I said, "just quieter." She hung up on me, and I sat there in the dim kitchen, listening to the clock tick, realizing that quiet was its own kind of weapon. After Christmas, I took a trip back to Dad's house, the one Evan had sold but hadn't yet been vacated by the new owners. I just wanted to see it once more before it changed hands forever. Snow covered the yard like a shroud. The porch swing was gone, but the oak tree stood firm, the same as ever. Inside, the air was cold and still. I walked from room to room, touching walls that no longer belonged to me. In the study, sunlight slanted across the desk where I'd found the flash drive. I sat in Dad's old chair and opened the wooden box again. The watch was there, gleaming faintly. I wound it once, listening to the faint, steady tick. It was the sound of time doing what it does best, moving forward, indifferent to us all. I found another envelope under the lining of the box, one I hadn't noticed before. My name was written in Dad's blocky script. I unfolded the letter carefully. "If you've come this far, you understand more than I could ever explain while I was alive. I didn't mean to leave things broken between you and Evan. But I knew he'd never see what mattered until he lost what didn't. You always saw through me, the parts of me I kept hidden. Maybe that's why I trusted you with the truth. You'll find that revenge doesn't fix things. It only reveals what was already broken. But sometimes, revelation is mercy. Don't waste your life guarding ghosts. Dad. The words blurred as I read them. I hadn't realized how much of my anger had been rooted in wanting him to admit what I'd always felt, that I was invisible to him. But in that letter, he had seen me, finally. I put the letter back, closed the box, and took it with me. Back home, the winter stretched on. School resumed after the holidays, and I slipped easily into the rhythm of teaching again. The kids didn't know anything about what had happened, of course. To them, I was just Miss Callahan, the teacher who sometimes stared out the window too long before answering a question. In March, a small package arrived at my doorstep. No return address. Inside was a folded check, $30,000, drawn from an anonymous source, with a note that said only for what was owed. I burned it that night in the fireplace. I didn't want a single piece of that world left in mine. But even as the ashes curled and rose, a strange calm settled over me. Not joy, not victory. Something deeper. A sense that balance, once set in motion, didn't need my hands anymore. That weekend, I drove out to the lake where Dad used to take me fishing when I was a kid. The dock was old, the boards soft with years of weather. I sat there for hours, watching the ripples fold and fade. The air smelled like pine and cold water. It struck me then that revenge wasn't about evening a score. It was about reclaiming a voice. Mine had been silenced for so long, drowned out by Evan's confidence, by Dad's silence, by the weight of being the one who stayed behind. But now, even in the quiet, my thoughts felt like my own again. When I left, I set the wooden box on the edge of the dock and let it go. It drifted out slowly, turning in the sunlight, until it sank beneath the surface with barely a sound. I kept only the watch, ticking steady against my palm. A month later, I ran into Halpern outside the grocery store. He looked smaller without his office, the sharp suit replaced by a wool coat and cap. "Sarah," he said, smiling faintly. "How are you holding up?" "I'm all right," I said. "You heard about Evan?" He nodded. "Yes, quite a mess, but it's not all bad. He's cooperating now, I hear, selling assets to pay what's owed. It might take years, but he'll survive." "Good," I said softly. "He's always been good at survival." Halpern looked at me for a long moment. "Your father would be proud of how you handled yourself." I shook my head. "No, he'd say I did what I had to." "That's another way of saying proud," he said, then walked away. That night, I dreamed again about the house, the oak tree, the golden light through the window. But in the dream, Dad was there, sitting at his desk, writing. He looked up, smiled slightly, and said, "It's done now, Sarah. You can rest." When I woke, I felt lighter than I had in years. By early summer, life had gone back to its small, predictable rhythm. My students wrote essays about forgiveness, and I listened to the clock tick through long afternoons. Some nights I'd sit on my porch with a glass of iced tea, the air warm and full of crickets, and think about all the ways revenge had rewritten me, not into someone harder, but someone clearer. Dad had been right. Revelation was mercy. I still wore the watch sometimes, the band worn smooth from years of his hands, and now mine. Every tick was a reminder, not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd finally learned to let go. And sometimes, when the evening light hit just right, I'd imagine him sitting there on the porch beside me, quiet as always. We wouldn't need to say much. Some apologies don't need words, only time. End of part 2. Next part deepens the emotional reckoning. Sarah's moral self-examination, a surprising encounter with Evan again, and how she learns to find closure beyond revenge. The summer Evan came back, the air in Millersburg hung heavy with rain. You could smell the thunder before it broke, that charged stillness that makes every sound sharper. I saw him first in the grocery store parking lot. I was loading bags into my car when I heard someone call my name. The voice was familiar, but it carried an edge that time had dulled. "Sarah," I turned. He looked thinner, almost fragile, like someone who'd been sanded down by life. His tan was gone, his hair was flecked with gray. The expensive ease he'd once worn like armor had cracked. "Hey, Evan." He hesitated, as if unsure whether I'd talk to him. "Didn't think I'd run into you." "This is Millersburg," I said quietly. "You run into everybody eventually." He half smiled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess that's true." For a long moment, we just stood there, the sound of carts rattling over asphalt filling the silence. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, "for the way things were after Dad died." I studied him, trying to find the old arrogance, the smug certainty. It wasn't there. "You don't owe me anything." "Yeah, I do." He looked down at his hands. "They froze everything, Sarah, every cent. I spent months thinking I could fix it. Lawyers, accountants, nothing worked. I kept asking myself why Dad would do that, why he'd build something that would collapse the second he was gone." He looked up, eyes red-rimmed but clear. Then I remembered what he used to say, about balance, about truth catching up. I felt my chest tighten. He believed in consequences. "Yeah," he nodded slowly. "I just never thought I'd be one." There was something raw in his voice. Not anger, not even regret exactly, but recognition. The kind that only comes when the ground finally stops giving way under you. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box, the kind jewelers use. "I wanted to give you this," he said. "I found it when they cleared my office." Inside was a gold tie pin with our father's initials engraved on it. "I think it was supposed to be yours," he said. "He had one for me, too." I looked at it, small, polished, meaningless, and yet somehow heavy with all the words Dad never said. "Thank you," I said softly. He nodded, then turned to leave. But before he got in his car, he stopped. "You knew, didn't you?" The question hung between us like a live wire. Knew what? That there was something hidden. The accounts, the money. You were always better at seeing the things I didn't. I didn't answer. The truth felt like a fragile animal between us, something that would die if handled too roughly. He let out a quiet laugh, half broken. "It doesn't matter. I think Dad wanted it this way." "He wanted us to learn," I said. "Yeah," he murmured. "Too bad it took losing everything." Then he drove away, leaving me standing in the drizzle with the tie pin in my hand and the ache of old ghosts stirring inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my porch, the rain a soft hiss against the eaves. The tie pin lay on the table beside Dad's watch. Both gleamed faintly under the porch light. Symbols of a man who had believed that lessons were more important than love, that the truth had to be earned, not given. For years, I'd carried the weight of his silence. Now I realized Evan had carried the opposite. The burden of being seen too much, too brightly, too soon. We were both just reflections of the same flaw. I thought about calling him, telling him that I'd been the one who sent the files, that I'd been the shadow behind his downfall. But the words felt hollow even before I said them in my head. What good would it do? He already knew, in his own way. The knowing wasn't punishment anymore. It was understanding. And understanding is the softer edge of revenge. School ended in June. On the last day, my students gave me a small box of letters, thank you notes, doodles, little fragments of who they were. I read them slowly, one by one, in the quiet of my empty classroom. One note stopped me cold. It was from a girl named Hannah, quiet, bookish, the kind who stayed after class to ask about writing. She'd written, "You always tell us that stories don't have to end happily, they just have to end truthfully. I think that's why I like your class." Truthfully, the word sat in my chest like a heartbeat. I left the classroom unlocked that afternoon and walked down to the river again. The air smelled of wildflowers and mud, and the light shimmered on the water like broken glass. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the current. When you live long enough in silence, you start to hear it differently. Not as emptiness, but as space, the kind that holds things instead of erasing them. I thought about Dad's letter. Revenge doesn't fix things. It only reveals what was already broken. Maybe he was right, but maybe revelation was its own kind of fixing. Later that summer, Evan called again. This time, his voice was calm, almost steady. "I got a job," he said, "out in Denver. Consulting, small stuff. It's different." "I'm glad," I said. "I won't lie," he added. "There are nights I still get angry, but I don't blame you anymore. I think maybe you were the only one who saw what Dad was really doing." "He was teaching," I said. "Teaching what? How to live with yourself." He laughed softly. "That's one hell of a class to fail." We didn't say goodbye, just sat there in the quiet hum of the line until he hung up. I stared at my phone for a long time after. Somewhere deep down, I realized I didn't hate him anymore. The anger had burned itself out, leaving something smaller but truer behind. Compassion, maybe, or the faint outline of forgiveness. That autumn, I started a new writing elective at school, Narratives of Justice. We studied stories where wrongs weren't righted cleanly, where characters found peace not by winning, but by letting go. When I told my students that justice wasn't always a courtroom or a punishment, sometimes it was just truth finding its way home, they nodded, some half understanding, some not at all. But one day, as they wrote their final essays, I watched the concentration on their faces and thought maybe that was enough. Maybe Dad had been right about one more thing. Balance takes time. That winter, Evan sent me a postcard. It showed a mountain range under snow, the kind of landscape that makes you believe in silence. On the back, he'd written, "I found peace out here. Thought you'd like to know." It wasn't an apology, but it didn't need to be. I pinned it to my refrigerator beside an old photo of us as kids, me and him and Dad standing by the oak tree. For years, I'd looked at that photo and seen only distance. Now I saw the small ways we were alike. The same wary smile, the same unspoken hope that someone would see us. Sometimes, healing is just learning to look again. One night in December, I was grading papers when the power went out. The house went completely dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlight through the curtains. I sat there listening to the hum of the quiet, no hum of refrigerator, no ticking clock, just stillness. I reached for Dad's watch on the table. It had stopped, the hands frozen at 10:43. For some reason, that felt right. Time doesn't need to move to mean something. I wound it once, softly, and set it back down. For the first time since his death, I whispered into the dark, "I understand, Dad." And maybe somewhere beyond whatever divides the living from the gone, he heard me. 10 years pass quietly when you're not watching the clock. I still teach, though my hair has more gray now and I keep a small pair of reading glasses on a string around my neck. The students come and go like seasons, bright, hopeful, fleeting. Sometimes I think that's the real rhythm of life. People arrive, learn what they can, and move on, leaving only their echoes. The house I live in now is small, a cottage with a porch covered in ivy. The watch sits on the mantel, still ticking. I keep it wound, not because I need to know the time, but because its steady rhythm reminds me of balance, the lesson my father left buried beneath guilt and secrecy. I haven't seen Evan in years, but we exchange Christmas cards. His handwriting has changed, looser, less guarded. The last card he sent had a photo of him standing outside a small cabin in the mountains. He looked ordinary, peaceful even. He'd written, "I'm doing fine, Sarah. Found work that matters. Hope you're happy too." I was. Sometimes I still think about that day in the lawyer's office, the sting of hearing my name listed under sentimental effects, the quiet humiliation of realizing that even in death, Dad had played favorites. But what I didn't understand then, I do now. The will wasn't about inheritance. It was about confession, about setting the stage for a truth that only loss could expose. Dad didn't leave me money. He left me the chance to see him clearly, flaws and all. And in doing that, he gave me something Evan never had. Understanding. That's the real inheritance. One afternoon, near the end of the school year, I brought my students outside for class. The air was warm, the field still damp from morning rain. We sat in a circle under the oak trees behind the school, the leaves whispering overhead. I asked them to write about justice in quiet places, not courts or battles, but in everyday life. They wrote about forgiveness, about parents, about small acts that felt like mercy. One boy read his essay aloud. He wrote about his older brother stealing from him and how instead of telling their parents, he left the door to his room open, hoping one day his brother would return the thing he took. "Sometimes," he read, voice cracking, "you just wait long enough for someone to learn their own lesson." I looked away so they wouldn't see the tears in my eyes. After class, as the students scattered, I stayed beneath the tree. The wind was soft, the light golden. I thought of Dad again, of the way he'd written, "Don't waste your life guarding ghosts." I realized I hadn't. Later that evening, I walked down to the river, the same river where I'd once let the wooden box drift away. The air smelled like rain and honeysuckle, and the sound of water was steady, eternal. For years, I'd thought revenge was something sharp, a blade, a strike, a taking back. But now I understood it differently. True revenge wasn't destruction. It was restoration, setting the world right again, even if it hurt to do it. Evan had his reckoning. I had mine. And maybe Dad, wherever he was, finally had his peace. I took the watch from my pocket and held it up to the fading light. The glass face caught the sunset, flashing gold before settling back to quiet. I could hear the faint, steady tick like a pulse. Time, still moving. I smiled then, small but real. For the first time, I didn't feel like someone avenging an old wound. I felt like someone who had finally walked out of its shadow. That night, as the crickets started up and the stars came out over the river, I sat on the porch and opened my journal. I wrote a single line at the top of the page, something I wanted to leave behind, in case anyone ever found it. Revenge isn't the fire that burns the past. It's the light that finally lets you see it. I closed the book, turned off the porch light, and let the dark fold around me, not as something to fear, but as something earned. The watch kept ticking softly in my hand, each second a reminder that even after all the endings, life still moves forward. And for once, I was content just to let it.